Thanks for everyone that's joined. We're going to just give it one more minute while as I'm seeing people log in. So we'll just give it just a minute. But one nice thing, it looks like it's a beautiful day here in Minnesota. I don't know where most other people that are signing in where they're from, but we're going to have a nice, cool holiday weekend. Low 70s. Except for if you're going to Madeline Island like Dyanne.
Where it'll be lucky to get to be 50s, I think.
Yeah. We'll give it just one more second and then we'll get going. We'll start. My name is Cory Parnell. I'm a principal at BGM, and I'm excited about this. It's a three-part series that we're going to be doing. We've called it Succession Success. So believe it or not, there's three major parts to this. One is the planning, the next is preparing, and then the final is profiting from exiting your business. And this is what I would say is an interactive webinar. So really, we do want you to ask questions. If it's not going to be addressed later in the presentation, then we'll address the question as it comes up. So again, we do highly encourage you to ask questions, and especially this team that we have assembled here on this subject matter. I'm excited, and one thing that going through this whole process, you'll really be depending on many team members to make it successful. So the group that we have here today for part one series, which is around planning, I'm excited to introduce. The first is Heidi Carpenter. She's a commercial attorney focusing primarily on providing counsel to investors, startups, and closely held businesses of all sizes, corporate transactions, as well as employment law. Heidi has been the FMGA for more than 25 years and has great experience of working with clients. The next individuals I'd like to introduce is Dyanne Ross-Hanson. Dyanne has over 30 years of industry experience. She's dedicated to assisting business owners in achieving their exit succession planning objectives by making well-informed, strategic, and tax-efficient decisions. So excited to have Dyanne on there. And lastly, I'd like to introduce my other partner, Blake Johnson, who has over 15 years of working closely with sellers and buyers and advises clients throughout the whole process of gathering information, marketing and transaction process, as well as his firm, SealedBid, is really a boutique firm that conducts a detailed search trying to find the key buyer for people that are looking to sell their company to a third party. So again, very excited about having this panel pulled together for today's subject. And then again, just finally, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will get to them. So I guess I'd like to kick this off. And the first is, I guess I'm going to start with Dyanne and Heidi is key exit strategies to consider and how do you evaluate the right one?
Yeah, I'll pipe in. To begin, oftentimes we're asked as professionals, how is it that you would define a successful exit for owners? And I oftentimes say, well, a successful exit is when the owner can depart on their timeline to the party of choice and for the dollars that they deserve. And in fact, as part of the planning process, I always start with owners in trying to identify, first of all, what their objectives are. And I ask them three basic questions. And there's more to ask, but the three basic questions I often ask is, when do you want to depart the business? Either financially, physically, or all together. In a perfect world, who would you like to see eventually own the company? Do you have a preference? And thirdly, what amount of financial capital are you dependent upon from the business in order to enjoy what you define as a successful retirement? Because when it comes time to evaluate the exit options, all of us here on the panel recognize that there's really only basically maybe four different strategies. One is an outside party, outside sale, financial, PE, strategic. One is a sale to inside, family, co-owners, key employees, ESOP. Another that is an option that I think owners often are surprised at is passive ownership. That's an option. And quite frankly, the last one is liquidation. It happens. So basically, each of those four strategies have advantages, disadvantages, different characteristics where they're appropriate. But really, the best strategy is usually dependent upon, again, when does the owner want to depart? What is their level of financial security with or without the business? What is the company's value? And do they need to make up a gap? What are their legacy goals, management capabilities, to name a few? That's just a brief overview of how I would answer that question, Cory.
And I would agree with you, Dyanne. I always ask, what is your number one goal? Is it maximizing your financial return? Is it preserving a legacy? Is it rewarding long-term employees? Is it ensuring family continuity? Because depending on what, and it might be a hybrid of several of those things. So depending on what your goal is, then your advisors can steer you toward what the best exit strategy is. And in my mind, I would say you've summarized it great, but there's the keeping it in the family, which is the the family succession option, where you create a plan to pass it on to your heirs and your children. There might be a sale to a co-owner or partner. There's the management buyout strategy. And then there's the ESOP, and those are all the, let's try to keep it in-house kind of transaction. And those all have a different set of pros and cons. I think sale to an outsider buyer, the minute I hear that someone wants to maximize financial return, it's hard to be a sale, taking it to the street and seeing who's gonna bid on it. So, but it also could be a merger or a strategic alliance, depending on what's going on with your industry. And liquidation might be, especially for a service business that's really driven by one or two key parties. Liquidation is sometimes an option because it's not sellable without those key parties being involved. But I think your goals have to be hashed out, and then your advisors can help steer you in the direction of which exit strategy will meet that goal best.
Yeah, that's a great point. Which then it kind of leads into, I guess I'm going to ask Blake, if it's a sale to a competitor or consolidator in the market or a third party, or even if it's I guess ESOP would be more internal, but how each option works, including the pros and cons and timing considerations, how do you go through that process?
Yeah, great question. And I'll try to break it down in a, easily digestible, concise response. And obviously we can spend, as the three of you know, spend a whole hour on each of those different categories. But, starting with ESOPs, and Dyanne has a lot of experience in the internal transfer side, but ESOP being an employee stock ownership plan, that really is something we've seen more in the marketplace, at least in discussionary basis. Candidly, we generally see owners ultimately decide to go a different route, but it is something that strikes interest with business owners because of the ability to empower and reward employees. And the definition of ESOP, again, employee stock ownership plan, and what that is sellers selling the ownership of the business to an ESOP trust, and the stock then being allocated to employees over time, or remaining employees, new employees, typically based on tenure or salary with a vesting schedule. And again, the pros, I think, are, really at the surface in that it allows maintenance of legacy, it rewards employees, it keeps culture and maybe even improves culture through, the ownership process. And it ultimately accomplishes the goal of an exit. But the cons, are real in that, generally speaking, the sellers are on the hook to play part of the financing and to participate and to wait for their payout over time as the company uses pre-tax profits to fund that purchase. And, in situations where an owner is exiting and giving up control of the business, if revenue were to change, flatten or go down, those types of payments then become at risk. So there's less cash at close and a larger assumed risk in that payout. The timeline is generally 6 to 12 months. It can be longer depending on how long it takes to set up. But, generally a good tool in the right situation. And I'll pause there to let the panel chime in on ESOP specifically before I move in to kind of third-party options. But any other comments or things I missed on ESOPs?
Yeah, I would agree with you, Blake. I think I'm starting to hear questions from my clients of maybe ESOP is the answer. And I think the basis for that is because they do want management continuity. They do want to award employees that have been very loyal to them. But after we talk about some of the setup and ongoing costs and the complex administration of it, it starts getting less attractive. And it's not right for every business. I really think you need 25 or more employees, and you have to have a pretty steady cash flow to make that workable, because you as in the company has to have a steady cash flow to fund repurchase obligations. So every time an employee resigns or is terminated, you have to buy back their shares. You usually finance an ESOP through company loans, which then burdens the company. So if revenue drops, there's a problem. There's really limited liquidity for the owner compared to an outright sale. And some of your employees might not be thrilled with having so much of the retirement savings heavily in the company stock, leaving them vulnerable to some struggles. But I think once we walk them down kind of the legal valuation and administrative fees that have to happen on the onset, but also have to happen annually, it starts becoming a very costly proposition for the owner. It's right for some companies, but for a lot of companies, it's not.
Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Heidi.
Go
Dyanne,
ahead.
anything else?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that in my experience, it's funny because I find that a lot of owners have heard of employee stock ownership plans, ESOPs, and almost invariably in our conversations, that question comes up as to, well, what about ESOP? And I think, just to reiterate what both of you have said, Blake and Heidi, I think that, I read a statistic that said that only 8% of companies within the United States are actually ESOP owned, which is fairly small. Reiterating what you both had mentioned, closely held companies, they'd have to have a very strong culture, very strong leadership team ready to be able to step up. And again, just like you had mentioned, Heidi, businesses with stable cash flow to support the ESOP debt repayments and repurchase obligations. They're a wonderful tax advantage, but surprisingly utilized in a very small percentage of cases, I find.
Yeah, and it's fairly, I think Heidi touched on this a little bit. It's fairly not inexpensive. There's a pretty good cost getting into it if you think about it. It's a retirement plan. ESOP is, which has to meet regulations. You need to bring in a trustee, as well as the funding component. And then CPA firms, we love it because normally there's an audit requirement. So And a lot of times companies have never gone through that process. So there is a heavy lift on the compliance as well as the cost of first setting it up, but then also maintaining that type of structure.
Yeah, that's great. Appreciate the additional color on ESOPs. And again, we see it raised frequently. So as we are here in our first session of 3 in the planning segment, I think it's important to define that, to explore it, because it is the right fit for some businesses. And as we transition to a third-party transaction, as Heidi previously alluded to, it depends on the goals. And if one of the goals is maximizing financial value, a third-party transaction is definitely one of those ways. And it's one of the ways at SealedBid, we work to build a process to identify the right types of buyers. So one category is strategic. So a strategic transaction, it can be a competitor, could be another industry or market participant. And really, in that sense, you're selling your business to another operating company. They can be local, they could be regional, they could be international. But the pros in that scenario are that they are able to look at your business in a strategic sense, both in the operations, but also in their financial model when it comes to making an offer. And so typically you could see a higher offer and a better structure from somebody who knows your industry, can immediately have synergistic benefits, whether they be from additional products or additional team strength or redundant cost reduction. And in a competitive process can yield a great result when the goal is maximizing value. The cons to that situation are that culture is likely going to be impacted. There is a possibility of operations moving or being absorbed, and there also might be negative impacts that ripple through from an industry or market perspective based on the competitive landscape. And so it's important when you're considering a transaction with a strategic acquirer to run a process and to be conscientious of some of those impacts and ultimately the business continuity going forward when you're working with your deal team in an M&A process. I'll pause there. Again, any additional insights from the panel on strategic transactions?
Yeah, I think merger or strategic alliances are interesting for companies who have identified expansion opportunities. And especially if the expansion opportunities are somewhere in their chain of supply. I think it's a really interesting option. So growth and scale would be a reason to pick that option. You can also do phased exits. So it doesn't have to happen so quickly, like just selling it. You might stay on board for a period of time to help integrate and do those things. I think the integration also does become challenging. And I think legacy is interesting because both parties come together thinking it's their legacy they're protecting. So that's a little challenging. I don't know if it's great for maximizing financial return, but I think it's a great option for capitalizing on expansion opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi. I agree. Any other comments before I start talking about financial acquirers?
Yeah, no, go.
Yeah, so and part of what Heidi just covered in that transition and participation in a transaction, that swings between strategic and financial. I would say from our exposure in the lower middle market, one of the benefits of a strategic deal is that they likely have the expertise that an owner does, and so they can create a quick transition if that's the goal. On the other hand, transitioning to financial acquirers, which cover the gamut all the way from an individual who's buying a business or a private equity group or a growing segment of family office buyers that are looking to diversify investments into businesses, all of which are looking at a business purchase and some sort of financial return goal. And in that situation, likely the culture is maintained, the leadership is leaned heavily on because you have a new owner that does not know the business or the industry as well as a strategic. And so to Heidi's previous comment, there are opportunities with this type of buyer category to, as an exiting owner, transition in a mutually beneficial way, whether that be rolling over equity or participating in a subsequent sale. That does create an option with financial buyers. Other pros of a financial buyer is, typically this can be done on a very confidential basis. There's maybe an opportunity for the marketplace never to know that the company is sold. There's obviously that culture and leadership maintenance. And really, I think what our experience is because of the realm of these financial buyers has expanded so vastly in the different categories, you can really try to hone in on the owner's goals and identify groups that align with those goals, whether it be growth or maintenance or legacy or participation in a community. There is an expanding group to target in this financial bucket. The cons, it's typically, a higher leveraged deal or a deal where value is based on financing ability. So there's, as the flip side of a strategic deal that can model in synergies, a financial acquirer is going to look at the standalone performance of your business. And there is the kind of stigma of private equity or some financial buyers that are really looking to buy, grow rapidly through expansion or reduce costs and then sell in a subsequent transaction. And could be a shorter time range of 3 years to 7 years to return their capital investment to their fund or other investors that help them do the original deal. So there's generally a consideration from business owners when looking at financial acquirers on what their thesis is for their interest in the business, how they're going to operate the business, and then again, what is their long-term plan or short-term plan, depending on their goals. Time considerations when selling to a third party, can be across the board. If you have somebody knocking at your door, you can get a deal done. I don't know, I may put Heidi's legal team, I might make them cringe, but 60 days, sometimes less. To run a full process, you're talking 6 to 8 to 12 months. And that would include proactively marketing your business and going through the limited auction process, but it can be across the board. It's really dependent on the level of interest and then the certain specifics that need to be diligenced and confirmed in getting a deal closed. Anything to add from the panel to that?
Yeah, the one thing that I had read is if you look at the amount of capital that PEs have in the marketplace, or I'll call it dry powder, I think towards the end of 2024, they're talking $2.2 trillion to invest. And just to give you an idea, I think in 2023, 2024, the IPO market was under, I think it's 300 million. So the capital raised by PEs, and I know in our industry, the CPA firms is heavily being approached, as well as other clients as well on the PE side. So I don't know if you guys are seeing it, but the level that I've seen in different industries by PEs is probably the highest I've ever seen. And when I hear that they have over $2.2 trillion of dry powder, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
I would say I saw a ton of investment during COVID in the 2 years following. And I think PE funds in particular were paying higher prices than maybe they should have during that period, and they're going through a reckoning on that right now. So I see that it no longer being such a seller's market like it was 3 or 4 years ago. There's definitely it's much more balanced. And I mean, we were doing deals without quality of earnings and without some fundamental diligence during those years because it was so competitive. We're kind of going back to what I would consider a more ordinary market for a seller. It's not a bad market, but it's more of an ordinary. So especially a PE fund, you'll be going through quality of earnings, old regular financial diligence that you would expect, and you'd be going through full legal diligence. I would say from the time you sign a letter of intent to the time you close, it's probably 90 days. That doesn't include any of the pre-planning that you might do internally. But I still believe that sale outside of your company in almost all cases will garner you the highest value for your company. And your liquidity is pretty quick. And I have some founders who say, yeah, I'll stick around because I want to stick around. I think then we talk about psychologically, you built that and you haven't been accountable to anyone. Rightfully so, it's your ship. It becomes very hard to be accountable to an institutional board and to watch decisions being made, like leveraging assets to load the company with a little more debt than maybe historically you've been comfortable with. So I always actually caution my founders, maybe you don't want to commit to 5 years. Maybe you commit to 1 to 3 or whatever's appropriate to transition customers, suppliers, and all of those things. But I think when you go to sell to an outside party, more likely than not, you want to leave in pretty short order.
Yeah,
If I could add to that, I was going to ask you, Blake, if one of the owner's objective, they know they want to go to the outside market because just like you had mentioned, Heidi, they're looking to try to maximize the value for their life's work. I'm curious, Blake, in your experience, if an owner says, it's really important, piggybacking on what you had just mentioned, Heidi, that I don't want to stick around for a long time. My exit, I want to be quick. I'm curious as to whether or not you find that more potentially viable either with a competitor purchase, a strategic, or a financial. Just out of curiosity, is one lend itself more to a quicker, blunt exit than another?
yeah, great question. And I think great question because we're in the planning subject matter here in this session. I think that is something that business owners need to get ahead of as far as they can in planning, because yes, I think at its surface, strategic or competitor or synergistic buyers will create potentially a quicker pathway to exit for an owner who's active in their business. And in all of these transactions, strategic or financial, it's about creating continuity and certainty post-transaction that cash flows and performance will continue. And if you're a business owner that's active 40 plus hours a week or 80 or 100, how business owners are, it's tough to sit across the table from somebody and say you're not required going forward. So that planning process, if you do not want to sell to a strategic, is to make sure that you have the leadership in place for you as an owner to go to the Bahamas for 2 weeks, to take real time away from the business and let the operation run itself and perform.
And I
Yeah.
also think, Dyanne, and you've probably seen this internally, how prepared is your business for you not to be in the seat?
Right.
Right? Because there's some businesses that say, I want out, but there's no possible way to do that because they have the only relationship with the key customer, or they can only do X, and they haven't really prepared management or anyone else in the organization to kind of do what they do.
Absolutely. The more and yeah, I would wholeheartedly echo that. The more owner centric the owner or the founder is to the business, the less marketable the company is, regardless of whether or not they want to sell to an outside or an inside party. So that, and we all advise our clients that, probably one of the greatest value drivers that they can focus on is reducing their dependency, the company's dependency upon the owner.
Well,
Well,
thank
that,
you. That's
that really, I was
Perfect.
gonna say, that really kind of leads us into the next, question is, how early should an owner and their advisory team start planning owner's exit? So Heidi, if you do you want to kick that off for us, what you see, what you think, and then,
I think if your succession or transition plan is internal, whether that's to the next generation family or sale to co-owners or maybe a management buyout, you really have to start thinking about that 3 to 4 years ahead of time. And I know that sounds extraordinarily long, but you have to make sure that your successors, first of all, have the right skills to do it. You have to make sure that if there's gonna be any conflict, you're addressing that appropriately and getting together ownership documents and all kinds of things. And then you also have to think about how it's being financed. So most of those deals require an element of seller financing because the management team might not have the resources just to pay you right away. So I would say and it seems counterintuitive that in order to do a transition internally, you would actually need more time to prepare. But that's just what I've found because there's a lot of human characteristics and resolutions that have to be addressed. I think if you're preparing for an outside sale, you could probably get things pretty buttoned up in ideally 2 years. I so rarely have a client who says, we've been pre-positioning everything for 2 years, probably a year. And a lot of that stuff is just putting structure into what the practice is. They might have a key client that they have a handshake deal on. You're gonna want to document that. They might have a secret sauce that nobody's actually gotten trademarked or patented. You want to get all of those things in line. You're going to want to figure out valuation of your organization, and you're really going to want to find a advisory team that you're comfortable with. All of that, those kinds of things take time, but almost not as much time as it does when it's an internal transaction.
Yeah, I would just simply add to that is that the funny thing is that I advise owners that they should really begin thinking about their inevitable exit when they start or take over their business, because time is the most valuable commodity when it comes to ownership or exit planning, because the more an owner has, the more time the owner has, the more successful their exit is going to be, whether it's an internal or an external. It's interesting to hear what you had said, Heidi, as far as internal, external. My advice to owners is if they're thinking of an external transition, they should really begin that planning effort no later than 1 to 3 years prior to sale. Basically just taking the time to get the business ready for the marketplace, having their audited and reviewed financial statements, documenting operational processes, updating the corporate books, records, diversifying their customer base, sustainable recurring revenue, profitability, growth strategies, all of paying down debt. All of those take time, whether it's internal or external. And I totally agree. Internal in particular, and I believe we'll get to this subject, but internal in particular take longer. They require a longer runway. And the reason is because the financing for those internal transitions is often more challenged in comparison to an external. But we'll talk maybe more about that. I say 5 to 10 year runway for internal. And again, owners roll their eyes. That's why I probably don't hear back from them. 5 to 10 years, I got plenty of time.
I can't think of one client I've had that said they've been preparing it for 10 years.
Yeah, 10 is long. 10 is long. Absolutely. They kind of have to hit the wall, so to speak, to begin taking this seriously.
I agree, it's ideal, but I don't think people spend enough time planning, period.
Yeah. Yeah. And the reality is it's inevitable,
Mhm.
voluntarily or involuntarily. It's going to
Yeah, and
happen.
I know just we're kind of touching on our next webinar on the the preparing. What are the
Yeah.
key things that you should be doing in order to prepare? And there, sometimes there's events, and I've had one client, you guys probably have seen this as well. The company was not prepared, and the key stakeholder entrepreneur passed away. So then the entity, the team was not really in a good position to really kind of carry forward. And the wife was the heir of the estate of the company. So uh, again, and I'm probably as sinful as anyone else is, when I was 55, 65 looked a long ways off. So, but it's looking a little closer these days. And it's unbelievable. Just look, even going back and looking at how quick time goes in your career is
Yeah.
amazing. So even a 5-year timeline
Yeah.
looks short as you get a little older.
And I think like you can underscore that the more prepared you are pre-transaction, the more likely
Right.
you're gonna get the value that you want.
Right.
You have to prepare. I mean, you can find out about all the weak spots in your financials in your company as you negotiate with a third party, but that's a really hard way to find out.
Yeah, totally agree. Your leverage in negotiation is definitely not the strongest when you're at the table, right? So to address those points that Heidi and Dyanne covered in customers or employees or whether it be contracts or just operations, those are the things in advance that create value, but also add leverage in negotiations and drive interest. So it's obviously
Right.
easier to hold to high values and to get that completed when there's multiple parties at the table interested, as opposed to finding a big black eye in due diligence and having essentially no leverage to renegotiate. But I think we're heading down that route. It'd be interesting, Dyanne, to have you dive deeper into the internal buyout options and I think we had phrased it as what those um, how you create long-term success in an internal succession strategies.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of what I experience for those owners as we're trying to identify, how much capital do you need in order to enjoy financial independence? Who would you like to transition to? And what's your departure date? Those things lend themselves to kind of direct them toward either an internal, an external, or ESOP, etc. In the internal transitions, just like you have both alluded to, that can be a co-owner of a privately held company. That can be family members, which is many businesses out there. It can be a smaller group of key managers. That's what I normally see. And that can be from one to, 3 or 4 or 5, doesn't have to be all employees. But the advantages cited, if you will, for trying to structure an internal transition is that it rewards your employees, if it's the employees that are buying, for their loyalty, for their service. It helps establish an owner mentality to help them help the owner grow the enterprise value. It in many cases is thought an internal transition can protect, preserve company culture. It can create a legacy to last beyond the owner's direct involvement. In some cases, it can retain marketplace confidentiality when the owner is looking to transition to an internal buyer. they can also have perhaps a little bit more flexibility, the owner can, to change their mind on a strategy if a gradual sale is utilized to an internal buyer, which I'll talk about. So, those are some of the advantages. I always chuckle a little bit because I say that, but there's a couple of really, really, one really huge disadvantage to an internal transition. And I'm sure if I were to ask, well, I will, what would you estimate is the biggest challenge to internal transitions? Anybody?
Conflict.
Well, that's a good one. We keep our business psychologists employed with that for sure.
Yeah,
My answer would be knowing that you got the right value.
That's also a
valuation.
good, that's also a very good one, because that what is fair value is such a gray area, especially in family transitions. That's a great suggestion or thought, but it's not the number one challenge. Cory, you're the last one standing.
I was with valuation because I hear that all the time.
That's a huge one. In fact, I was working with an owner not long ago who was looking at a family transition. And as we were beginning our discussion, I said, so, well, what do you think the business is worth? And he gave me a figure, and I says, okay, so how is that established? He says, well, that's what my financial advisor told me I needed in order to be able to retire. I said, well, that's great. That's great, but that doesn't necessarily equate to what the actual value of the company is. But oftentimes that's how it's determined. Number one challenge to internal transitions where the owner is not looking to gift is access to capital. Because most of your inside buyers, co-owners, family members, if the founders determine that they need cash versus reducing their estate value through gifting, your key employees, oftentimes, unless they have ownership in the company, they're not particularly bankable to be able to go out and get outside financing. So the reality is, on internal transitions, outside of gifting, which is an option, outside of gifting is access to adequate capital. And the result is that oftentimes those internal transitions are going to be financed through ongoing cash flow from the business, that hopefully the successors are increasingly responsible for maintaining or increasing. So that's, access to capital, that's the biggest thing, but valuation is a big one. And in fact, that's where I believe any type of planning for which is best has to start. Very finally, strategies, it can be an outright sale, it can be an installment sale, it can be a gradual sale, it can be gifting, it can be gifting at lifetime, it can be gifting at death, it can be a combination of gifting and sale, it can be a formation of a new entity, it can be an employee stock ownership plan. All of those are potential options for internal transitions. And the owner has, in my experience, owner has to be really committed to an internal transition above maximizing value, which is what we talked about, the advantage of going outside. I don't know if that's similar.
Yeah, and I guess when I was saying valuation, for me, it comes to really as the company operates, even if you make some adjustments for a family or
Discounts?
no, not discounts. I'm forgetting the term. It's a lifestyle
Minority?
business. Lifestyle business. Even if
Lifestyle,
you make
absolutely.
adjustment for a lifestyle business, is that cash flow will only support a certain valuation. Versus if you have a PE that's coming in, and when they're coming in, that company isn't going to operate the way it does today. The growth metrics and the performance metrics will definitely change because the PE is looking to drive value, short term and
Absolutely.
long term. So when I
Absolutely.
say value, that's where I've seen the differences. The multiples for
Yeah.
PE are different than a multiple for an internal sale, and that comes to bank financing. Banks are conservative; they need collateral, debt service coverage ratio, things of that nature to make it happen.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think organically, business owners who want to do an internal transition have psychologically already let go of the quick liquidity and that we're gonna get the highest price because their goals are fundamentally legacy, family wealth transfer, family involvement, um, culture, all of those kind of almost intangible things, loyalty. So they usually don't, once someone determines that that's really what they want, they're okay
Yeah.
being patient with getting their liquidity. They're probably okay with not maximizing price and maybe doing some seller financing things.
Yeah.
And that's probably appropriate because when you think about preparing your company for a transition for an outside sale, you're preparing processes and all kinds of things. But for the most part, people taking over have done it before, they're perfectly capable. When you're talking about family succession or management succession, you might have a group of people that are very smart, but they just currently lack the skills or the mindset
Right.
they need. And it might take
Right.
to get them there anyway. So if there's a more gradual transition, it's probably good for them too.
Yeah, to that point, I'll just add, the entrepreneurial spirit, like you stated, Heidi, exists in some, but not all leaders. And so you, like, to your point, you could have very talented management, but when, a transaction or an internal buyout requires a personal signature on a piece of debt at the bank, deals fall apart there because that's putting your house up, that's getting your spouse and your family committed to this, and that's a major hurdle in internal deals.
And I've seen some families do this so artfully. I represent a company that's on their fourth generation. And they have kind of a system in place where if the successor doesn't have a certain skill set, they may allow him or her to go and get that. So they might be a great operator, a little weak on finance, so they have them go and do that. They might put a more institutional board in place that have
Mhm.
that have the skills that maybe that generation lacks, so they have a board to learn from. I think families who are committed to that kind of succession, some do it really artfully, in the right way, but you can do that wrong pretty fast. I have had clients say, you gotta help me out with this. Because my brother is doing this, but we have to have Thanksgiving at his house next week. So those, you really need a good professional advisory team for those kinds of transitions if your family hasn't done it before.
Yeah, and you make me think of, and Dyanne, you kind of touched on this, when you're dealing with family. And I believe you and I were discussing a client that has this, where you have some of the family members actually work within the business, some at a high level, some not at a high level, but then what do you do about the family members that are not working in the business? And, the succession planning around that, the complexity and, how do you maneuver that?
It's called the fair versus equal conundrum, which is an issue for every family-owned business who has multiple offspring and some involved. We call them active, some inactive. I always tell clients that equal ownership disbursement is never fair. And in fact, it's probably more of a recipe for a disaster than continued success. Equal ownership.
Yeah, yeah. Just real quick, I know we're coming to the top of the hour, but one of the things, Diane, maybe you could talk about how to align your exit path with both your personal, financial, and business objectives, And you kind
Yeah,
of touched on this before. It was like the owner is like, well, this is what my wealth advisor told me
yeah.
number I need.
Again, I think a lot of it just centers on, and I approach this exit planning very much from the financial standpoint versus the psychological aspects, which quite frankly are worth a potential whole other webinar, if you will. So from the tactical side of planning, I always say whether the owner is considering an internal transition, an external transition, or maybe just retained ownership. I think that the important thing for them is to begin contemplating some of those options earlier versus later. To be able to educate themselves, what are some of the options available? What are the advantages and the disadvantages? And just like you mentioned, Heidi, as well as you, Blake, it's a process that requires input and expertise from a multidisciplinary team of advisors dedicated to helping educate owners and reach, their stated objective. The owner is at the center of the advisory team planning. And of course, I always suggest building flexibility to allow the owner to change course as time and circumstance dictate. It always does. I worked for 6 months with an owner trying to figure out a plan to transition to a fourth generation owners. And after 6 months of going back and forth, the owner finally decided, no, this isn't going to work. And the successors said, no, we're not interested. And we ended up going to an outside sale. And now everyone is very happy. Given the fact that for most business owners, their business represents over 75% of their personal net worth, I can't emphasize enough the importance of beginning early, because time with exit planning is where success with exit planning comes. And again, it's probably the most significant financial event of an owner's life. And inevitable at that. I know I'm not sure if that answered directly your question or not, Cory.
No, it did. And I know at BGM this past year, we're trying to approach our clients and be part of that conversation with their wealth advisor, estate attorney or planner, or their business advisor, just to understand how the business fits into their success, long-term success, as well as, we have clients, I'll call it generational wealth. They've already accumulated more than what they could ever spend. So what's that generational look like? And then when do you start having the conversation with your kids that might be in their, I call them kids, they're 30, 35, Blake, you're still a kid. When do you start having those conversations? Because it is generational. And then did you set up a charitable fund that, again, will be, your intention is to be generational? And, how do you loop your kids or next generation in on that?
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah. This has been a great conversation. I really look forward to the next two series. I definitely hope some individuals that have listened to this, that they've got some good golden nuggets. That's what I always look for from a webinar. Unfortunately, we didn't have any questions. So we probably did a great job just kind of touching the base on this. And again, looking forward to part 2 series. And for those that we're able to attend and not able to attend, we will be emailing this recording out to everyone. And if you do have any questions for any of the panelists, please inquire. I believe the contact information will be shared with everyone. So again, I appreciate everyone's time. Great conversation. I look forward to session number 2 on preparing, which again could take, I'd love to hear 10 years, but 5 years would be great. And probably 90 days would be something I don't look forward to. But again, thank you all for your time, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cory.